from rice fields to golden dreams. They came across the Pacific in creaking wooden ships and steel steamers. Young men with calloused hands, wide eyes, and hearts full of impossible dreams. They were farmers, fishermen, students, and wanderers, each carrying a single suitcase and 1,000 hopes. The year was 1903. The destination? America, the land they had heard of in whispers and legends, where the streets were said to be paved with gold. But when the first wave of Japanese immigrants stepped onto the docks of San Francisco, the golden streets were nowhere to be found. Instead, they were met by the smell of salt and smoke, by curious stares, and by a quiet question that would haunt them for decades. Can they ever be one of us? The seeds of a new beginning. Back in Japan, the Meiji Restoration had transformed a nation overnight, from samurai swords to steam engines, from isolation to ambition. Yet opportunity was uneven. Rural farmers and fishermen in prefectures like Hiroshima, Yamaguchi, and Okinawa faced crushing poverty and rising taxes. Letters from across the ocean told of vast fields in California and Hawaii, where hard work could turn dreams into dollars. So they came, Nisei, the first generation of Japanese immigrants. They bent over California soil from dawn till dusk, coaxing life out of land others had abandoned. With skill and discipline inherited from their samurai ancestors, they transformed barren acres into fertile gardens. By 1910, Japanese farmers produced nearly 10% of California's fruits and vegetables, though they made up less than 2% of its population. But success invited resentment. Newspapers began to call them the Yellow Peril, claiming they would outwork and outsmart white farmers. Laws soon followed. The California Alien Land Law of 1913 barred them from owning property. The dream of belonging seemed to fade like dust in the fields they had sown. Between two worlds. Yet the Nisei endured. They sent for their wives, or in some cases, picture brides, women they had only known through photographs. Together they built families and small communities, Japantowns or Nihonmachi, in cities like San Francisco, Seattle, and Los Angeles. Their children, the Nisei, were born American citizens. They spoke English, played baseball, and recited the Pledge of Allegiance in school. Yet even they were reminded of their difference. Teachers would praise their diligence, but question their loyalty. Neighbors smiled politely, but locked their doors. Still, within the Nisei burned a quiet pride, the belief that hard work, education, and service could bridge the cultural divide. They studied to become doctors, lawyers, engineers, professions their parents could never dream of. And when the stars and stripes flew high, they saluted with the same devotion as any American child. They believed that the soil of America could grow new roots, that someday they would truly belong. Shadows of War. Then came December 7th, 1941. The news crackled over radios across America. The Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor. In an instant, everything changed. The same faces that once smiled now turned away. Storefronts were vandalized. Neighbors whispered. Within days, Japanese banks were frozen, businesses shut down, and community leaders arrested without charge. On February 19, 1942, Executive Order 9066 sealed their fate.
Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of them U.S. citizens, were forced from their homes and sent to internment camps, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Families who had spent decades building their American dream watched it all disappear in a matter of days. Farmers sold acres for pennies. Shopkeepers left signs on their doors that read, "Closed until victory." Many never reopened. Inside the camps, dust storms swept through the barracks. Privacy was a memory. Yet even behind fences, the Issei and Nisei refused to surrender their dignity. They built schools, held weddings, and planted gardens in the desert sand, proof that life, like hope, can grow anywhere. Loyalty in question. When the U.S. Army distributed a loyalty questionnaire to Japanese Americans in 1943, the questions cut deep. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States? Will you serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty? For many, these words were salt in an open wound. How could they prove loyalty to a country that imprisoned them without reason? And yet, thousands answered yes.
They volunteered to fight for the very flag that waved above their prison camps. They became part of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a segregated Japanese-American unit that would go on to earn more medals than any other in U.S. military history. In the muddy hills of Italy and the forests of France, they charged forward, shouting their motto, "Go for broke." They rescued trapped battalions, stormed enemy lines, and carried wounded comrades through fire and blood. While their families remained behind barbed wire, these young men wrote a new definition of patriotism, one measured not by birth or color, but by courage. After the war. When the war ended, the Nisei soldiers returned home to a nation still struggling with its conscience. Many of their families had lost everything. Their farms were gone, their shops empty. Yet they started over, quietly, resiliently. They rebuilt communities from the ground up. They became teachers, engineers, artists, and activists. The children of the camps and battlefields would one day help shape modern America, from the civil rights movement to Silicon Valley. In 1988, after decades of silence, the U.S. government formally apologized for the internment, calling it a grave injustice. Survivors received letters signed by the president and small reparations. But for many, the true restoration came not in words or money, but in recognition. Recognition that they were and had always been American. The legacy of the American samurai. The story of the Japanese immigrants who crossed the Pacific is not just one of hardship, it's one of transformation. They carried with them the ancient code of the samurai, Bushido, a belief in honor, discipline, and duty. In America, that code evolved. The sword became the plow, the armor became determination, and the battlefield became the struggle for equality. From the rice fields of Hiroshima to the strawberry farms of California, from the camps of Manzanar to the battlefields of Italy, they proved that identity is not dictated by fear, but forged in resilience. Today, their legacy lives on in every Japanese American who still dares to dream, who still believes that loyalty is not inherited, but chosen. Theirs is a story of quiet strength, of people who refuse to let prejudice define their destiny. They came seeking golden dreams and found something even greater, the power to redefine what it means to be American.
The silent warriors of a divided land. The morning sun rose over the Pacific, gilding the rooftops of California with light that felt almost foreign. On that quiet December day in 1941, America still believed itself safe behind oceans. By nightfall, that illusion was gone. Pearl Harbor had been bombed, and in one instant, everything changed, for the nation and for those who looked like the enemy. Across the West Coast, Japanese Americans woke up to find their loyalty on trial. The same men who had worked the soil, run small shops, and saluted the stars and stripes now faced suspicion, hatred, and exile. Yet in the face of prejudice and betrayal, thousands of them, quiet, disciplined, and determined, prepared to fight for the very country that no longer trusted them. They were the silent warriors of a divided land. Shadows after the blast. When radio broadcasts carried the words, "Japan attacks Pearl Harbor," it was as if the world tilted on its axis. American flags were lowered to half-staff, factories roared into war production, and overnight, every Japanese American became a potential traitor in the public eye. Rumors spread faster than facts. Newspapers screamed headlines like, "Enemy aliens among us." FBI agents knocked on doors in San Francisco, Seattle, and Los Angeles, arresting community leaders, teachers, Buddhist priests, and anyone who had ties to Japan. Within 24 hours, more than 2,000 men were detained without charges. Their only crime? Ancestry. In small towns, families burned Japanese books, family heirlooms, and letters from relatives overseas, hoping to prove their loyalty. Children were told not to speak Japanese in public. Storefronts that once read Tanaka Grocery or Kobayashi Laundry now simply said American owned. And yet, beneath this growing fear, a question echoed in thousands of hearts. How do you prove love for a country that no longer believes you belong? The camps of silence. By early 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9006, authorizing the forced removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. Families were given just days to pack. Bring only what you can carry. What followed was one of the darkest moments in American democracy. Over 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, were sent to internment camps scattered across deserts and mountains. They left behind farms, homes, and shops that had taken decades to build. On train platforms, mothers clutched children as soldiers with rifles stood watch. Dust rose as the convoys rolled toward places with names like Manzanar, Tule Lake, Hart Mountain, and Poston, barbed wire cities where freedom became memory. The camps were cold in winter, scorching in summer. Families slept in barracks with caper-thin walls, their privacy stolen, their dignity tested. They lined up for food, shared latrines, and endured the constant hum of suspicion from guards who watched from towers. But even in these places of exile, the human spirit refused to die. Schools were built, baseball leagues formed, and churches opened their doors. Children studied civics lessons about liberty, while outside their classrooms, armed soldiers patrolled the fences. One internee wrote in her diary, "We pledge allegiance to the flag every morning, but does the flag still pledge allegiance to us?" loyalty in question. In 1943, the U.S. government distributed a loyalty questionnaire to all internees. It was meant to separate the loyal from the disloyal, a test of allegiance to a country that had imprisoned its own citizens. Two questions ignited fierce debate. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty? Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor? For the Nisei, the first-generation immigrants barred from becoming U.S. citizens, renouncing the emperor meant becoming stateless. For the Nisei, American-born citizens, the questions felt like betrayal. How could they be asked to prove loyalty they never abandoned? Some refused to answer, earning the label, "No Boys." They were sent to segregation centers like Tule Lake, branded as potential enemies. Others answered yes to both, volunteering to fight for the same government that had caged their families. Their decision would change history.
The call to serve. In 1943, the U.S. Army formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a segregated unit composed almost entirely of Japanese-American volunteers. From Hawaii to the mainland camps, thousands enlisted, eager to prove that their heritage did not define their patriotism. They trained at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, where locals eyed them with the same suspicion they had faced back home. Yet the soldiers pressed on, driven by a quiet rage and unshakable pride. They called themselves "Go for Broke," a phrase from Hawaiian gambling slang meaning risk everything for one big win. Their chance came in Europe. In the hills of Italy, the 442nd fought with unmatched ferocity, rescuing trapped Allied battalions and breaking through enemy lines. In the forests of France, they earned the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion, not for the medals they sought, but for the wounds they endured. They became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, over 9,000 Purple Hearts. Behind every medal was a paradox, young men proving loyalty while their families remained imprisoned at home. Letters across the divide. In the camps, mothers waited for letters from sons who fought overseas. Each envelope bore the same stamp, U.S. Army Postal Service. Inside were words that carried both pride and pain. Dear Mom, we fought hard today. The boys here don't talk much about home, maybe because we're afraid of what we'll find when we return. But I want you to know I fight with everything I have because someday I want to walk through our front door and feel like we belong again. Some letters never made it back. The silence that followed was heavier than the fences. And when the soldiers returned, their uniforms did not guarantee acceptance. Some towns refused to serve them in restaurants. Others spat at their medals. But within the Japanese-American community, these men became legends, proof that courage can bloom even in captivity. Breaking the silence. After the war, America began to reckon with its conscience. The images of the camps and the bravery of the Nisei soldiers forced a nation to confront its contradictions. The same newspapers that once printed "enemy race" now ran headlines praising the 442nd's heroism. Presidents and generals spoke their names with reverence. But true justice came slowly. Decades later, survivors of the internment would fight for recognition. Their children, lawyers, activists, and politicians carried the torch. Finally, in 1988, the U.S. Congress passed the Civil Liberties Act, officially apologizing for the internment and offering reparations to survivors. President Ronald Reagan signed it into law, declaring, "Here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment to equal justice under the law." For many, it was more than an apology. It was validation that silence had not been in vain. Legacy of the Silent Warriors. Today, the story of the Japanese Americans who lived through that era stands as both a wound and a warning. It reminds us that fear can blind even a free nation, and that true patriotism often blooms in the darkest of places. From the battlefields of Europe to the camps of California, they proved that honor is not inherited, it is chosen. They fought not for recognition, but for the belief that freedom once denied must be defended by those who understand its cost. The silent warriors of a divided land did not march for vengeance, they marched for belonging, and in doing so, they stitched their story into the very fabric of America. Their legacy whispers still in every immigrant's heartbeat, in every flag raised above doubt, a reminder that love of country means more when it is tested, and that silence, when endured with dignity, can speak louder than hate.
Behind barbed wire and broken trust. The desert wind howled through the Sierra Nevada, rattling thin wooden walls and scattering dust across endless rows of tar paper barracks. From above, the Manzanar camp looked like a prison dropped in the middle of nowhere. Barbed wire, guard towers, floodlights. But inside, behind those fences, lived over 10,000 souls. Farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and children. Americans stripped of their homes and dignity, waiting for a country that no longer trusted them to remember who they were. It was 1942, and freedom had a new shape: fences. Yet from within that desolation, something extraordinary began to rise: courage. Young men, born under the same flag that now flew over their prison, stepped forward and volunteered to fight, not for vengeance, not for forgiveness, but for honor, to prove that their loyalty could not be confined by wire or suspicion. They called themselves the Nisei soldiers, and their journey from behind the fences of Manzanar and Heart Mountain to the battlefields of Europe would become one of the most remarkable chapters in American history. The day everything changed. Before Pearl Harbor, life for Japanese Americans had been a delicate balance of hope and hard work. They ran small farms in California's Central Valley, managed fishing boats in Seattle, and operated corner stores in Los Angeles. They were Americans in every way but one. They still had to prove it. Then came December 7th, 1941. As news of Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor spread, fear turned to fury. Overnight, Japanese Americans, even those who had never seen Japan, became targets of suspicion. FBI agents raided homes, confiscating cameras, radios, and family heirlooms. Newspapers printed headlines like "Japanese on coast pose threat." Within weeks, rumors and hysteria grew so intense that President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced relocation of Japanese Americans from the West Coast. The order didn't mention Japanese by name, but everyone knew who it meant. Bring only what you can carry. The notice appeared on telephone poles and shop windows. All persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien, will be evacuated. You may bring only what you can carry. In a single sentence, a lifetime was reduced to a suitcase. Families sold cars for pennies, left pets behind, and locked doors they would never open again. On train platforms, soldiers stood guard as mothers tried to comfort crying children. Fathers, once proud landowners or businessmen, carried cardboard tags marked with family numbers, as if they were inventory, not citizens. The trains took them inland, away from the ocean they loved, to desolate camps surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers. The names sounded almost poetic: Manzanar, Heart Mountain, Poston, Tula Lake. But the reality was far from it. Life in the desert. At Manzanar, the air was dry and biting. In winter, snow from the mountains froze the water pipes. In summer, temperature soared past 100 degrees. Dust storms swept through the barracks, coating everything in grit. Each family lived in a single room, often no larger than a small garage. Privacy vanished. Thin walls separated entire families. The communal bathrooms had no partitions. At night, the wind carried the hum of floodlights and the crunch of soldiers' boots along the fence line. Yet amid this injustice, life persisted. Teachers organized schools with donated books. Artists built theaters and painted murals. Baseball diamonds appeared in the dirt. Weddings were held, babies were born, and gardens bloomed in the sand, a defiant reminder that dignity cannot be imprisoned. Still, the sense of betrayal lingered like an open wound. These were citizens, taxpayers, students who recited the Pledge of Allegiance every morning. And now their own government had branded them enemy aliens. A sign appeared on the camp fence, scrawled in chalk by an unknown hand. I am an American. Heart Mountain and the Fire Within. Among the camps, Heart Mountain in Wyoming became a symbol of both resistance and resilience. Here, thousands of Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, faced an agonizing choice when the U.S. government introduced the loyalty questionnaire. Two questions in particular divided families and friends. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty? Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor? Answering yes could mean leaving the camp to fight for the same nation that imprisoned your parents. Answering no could mean being labeled disloyal and sent to the infamous Tula Lake Segregation Center. Some refused to enlist not out of defiance, but principle, demanding that the government first restore their rights before asking for their service. They became known as the Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee, peaceful resistors who faced imprisonment for draft evasion. Others, including hundreds of young men who could not bear to see their honor questioned, answered yes and volunteered.
The birth of the 442nd. In 1943, the U.S. Army formed the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed almost entirely of Japanese Americans. The irony was staggering. While their families remained behind barbed wire, these young men would go on to fight and die for the same flag flying above their camps. They trained at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, alongside Hawaiian Japanese Americans who had not been interned. At first there was tension. The Hawaiians couldn't understand how mainland Nisei tolerated such treatment, while the mainlanders resented their freedom. But through grueling drills and shared sacrifice, they forged an unbreakable brotherhood. Their motto, "Go for broke," meaning to risk everything for one chance at victory. And they did. Battlefields of Redemption. The 442nd's baptism of fire came in Italy, where they scaled mountain cliffs under enemy fire to break through the Gothic line. Later, in France, they faced one of their greatest challenges, rescuing the Lost Battalion, a group of surrounded American soldiers from Texas. For days, the Nisei advanced through rain, mud, and machine gun fire. Casualties mounted, but they refused to retreat. When they finally reached the trapped soldiers, the Texans could hardly believe who had saved them, men whose families were still behind fences back home. The cost was staggering. Out of 275 men who began the rescue mission, only 40 walked out unhurt. But the legacy was immortal. The 442nd became the most decorated unit in U.S. military history, earning over 9,000 Purple Hearts and 21 Medals of Honor. General Mark Clark would later say, "They fought not only the enemy, but prejudice." And they won. Letters home. Back in the camps, families clung to every letter from the front. Mothers read them aloud to children who barely understood what war meant. Each envelope stamped U.S. Postal Service carried both pride and pain. Dear Mom, the war is terrible, but I fight so that someday we can come home, not to a camp, but to a real house with a door that opens to freedom. Some letters returned unopened, marked deceased. In the barracks, silence fell like a prayer. The end of the fences. When the war ended in 1945, the camps began to close, but freedom didn't come easily. Japanese Americans returned to find their farms sold, their shops looted, their homes occupied. Many towns refused to welcome them back. Still, they rebuilt, slowly, painfully. They opened new businesses, sent their children to college, and began to reclaim what was lost. The Nisei veterans came home not as victims, but as heroes, though their medals could never erase the memory of barbed wire. Decades later, in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, formally apologizing for the internment and offering reparations. It was a moment of long-delayed justice, but for many survivors, the real victory had been achieved long before, in the deserts where they kept their humanity, and on the battlefields where they proved their loyalty beyond question. Legacy of courage. The story of those behind the fences is not just about injustice, it's about endurance. It's about men and women who refused to let betrayal define them, who transformed confinement into conviction. From the dust of Manzanar to the snow of Heart Mountain, from the silence of the camps to the thunder of the battlefield, they taught a nation the true meaning of honor. Behind barbed wire and broken trust, they built something indestructible, faith. And in doing so, they rewrote what it meant to be American.
The 442nd. Valor Beyond Prejudice. The mud of Europe was thick with the weight of war, rain, blood, and the echoes of men shouting in languages from every corner of the world. Among them marched a battalion that didn't quite fit the picture of the typical American soldier. Their faces were different, their eyes shaped by another land, yet their hearts beat red, white, and blue. They were the sons of farmers, fishermen, and shopkeepers, many with families imprisoned behind barbed wire back home. They called themselves the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They weren't fighting just the Nazis. They were fighting a second war, a war for dignity, for identity, for the right to call America home. And in doing so, they would redefine what it meant to be loyal, brave, and free. Born behind barbed wire. The 442nd was born not in glory, but in suspicion. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese Americans were branded enemy aliens. Over 120,000 were forced into internment camps, stripped of their rights and property. Yet, even as they lived under guard, many volunteered to fight for the very nation that had doubted them. In 1943, the U.S. War Department reversed its earlier ban on Japanese Americans serving in combat and called for volunteers. The response was staggering. From Hawaii alone, over 10,000 men applied, so many that the Army had to turn most away. From the mainland camps came another 1,200, young men who left their families behind fences to prove that loyalty could not be confined. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, these two groups, Hawaiians who had never been interned and mainlanders who had lost everything, trained together. At first, tension ran high. The Hawaiians couldn't understand the quiet pain of the mainlanders, while the mainlanders envied the Hawaiians' freedom. Fistfights broke out. But one visit to an internment camp changed everything. When the Hawaiian soldiers saw the barbed wire, the guard towers, the faces of children behind fences, they finally understood what their brothers had endured. From that day forward, they stood united. Their motto was simple: go for broke. It meant to give everything, win or lose, for one final shot at glory. Baptism by fire. Italy, 1944. In June 1944, the 442nd landed in Italy. They joined forces with the 100th Infantry Battalion, another Japanese-American unit that had already been in combat and earned the nickname the Purple Heart Battalion for their bravery and heavy losses. Together, they would make history. The terrain was brutal. Jagged mountains, mud-soaked valleys, and minefields that swallowed men whole. German snipers lurked in the hills. Artillery thundered day and night. But the Nisei soldiers pressed on with unshakable discipline. At Anzio and Bruyere, they charged uphill through enemy fire, refusing to retreat. One sergeant wrote in his journal, "We fight like men who have something to prove, because we do. Every bullet we fire, every inch we take, is a step closer to home, to justice." In battle, they earned respect. Their officers, many of whom had initially doubted them, began to see not Japanese boys, but warriors. General Mark Clark would later write, "They fought with a loyalty and bravery beyond anything I had ever seen. They fought not only the enemy, but prejudice, and they won." The rescue of the lost battalion. Then came the mission that would seal their legend. In October 1944, in the forests of Vosges in France, a Texan unit, the 1st Battalion 141st Infantry Regiment, was cut off behind enemy lines. Surrounded by German forces, low on food and ammunition, they were doomed unless someone could break through. The 442nd was called in. For 6 days they fought uphill through dense woods and relentless gunfire. The rain turned the ground into a swamp of blood and mud. Every step forward cost lives, but retreat was not an option. Private Sadao Munamori dove on a grenade to save his comrades, an act that would posthumously earn him the Medal of Honor. Others fought until their rifles were empty, then charged with bayonets. When the smoke cleared, the 442nd had rescued 211 Texans, but at the cost of over 800 casualties. The soldiers they saved could hardly believe it. One Texan said, "They look different from us, but they were more American than anyone I've ever known."
Valor beyond prejudice. By the war's end, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team had become the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. Their record was staggering: 21 Medals of Honor, 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, 560 Silver Stars, 9,486 Purple Hearts, 7 Presidential Unit Citations. But medals could not capture what they had endured. Many returned home to find their families still in camps. Others discovered their homes sold, their farms lost, their towns hostile. Still, they held their heads high. They had fought not for gratitude, but for truth, that loyalty is not measured by the color of one's skin or the shape of one's eyes, but by the courage within. The homecoming that wasn't. When the war ended, the returning Nisei soldiers expected some measure of welcome. Instead, many faced the same suspicion that had sent them to the camps. Signs still hung in shop windows, "No Japs allowed." But this time, the silence broke. Their bravery had not gone unnoticed. by all. In Hawaii, the 442nd's legacy inspired a political movement, one that would eventually lead to the election of Japanese-American leaders like Daniel Inouye, a 442nd veteran who lost his arm in combat and went on to serve as a U.S. Senator for nearly 50 years. Across America, the story of their valor began to shift public opinion. The sight of Japanese-American soldiers saluting the flag, their uniforms heavy with medals, forced the nation to confront its hypocrisy. The 442nd didn't just win battles overseas, they won hearts at home. Heroes remembered. Decades later, the world would finally recognize what the 442nd had accomplished. In 2000, the surviving veterans were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest civilian honors in the United States. At the ceremony, President Bill Clinton said, "Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill-treated." In that moment, history came full circle. The fences had long been torn down, the camps abandoned to dust, but the legacy of the 442nd still stood tall, a monument to faith and perseverance. Today, their story is taught in classrooms, honored in museums, and remembered at memorials from Honolulu to Washington, D.C. But perhaps their greatest memorial lies not in stone or bronze, but in the lesson they left behind. That true valor transcends fear. That patriotism means standing for a country even when it does not stand for you. And that courage, in its purest form, knows no color, no ancestry, only purpose. The legacy of Go for Broke. The phrase still echoes across generations, go for broke. It was more than a battle cry. It was a philosophy, a way of life for those who refused to be broken by injustice. The men of the 442nd showed America and the world that strength is born from struggle, that unity can rise from division. They proved that loyalty cannot be legislated, nor can it be destroyed by fear. From the camps of California to the hills of Italy and the forests of France, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team carried not just rifles, but a nation's conscience. They fought 2 wars and won them both, one against tyranny abroad, and another against prejudice at home. And in doing so, they wrote one of the most powerful truths in American history, that sometimes the bravest soldiers are those who fight to be seen as American in the first place.
Letters from the front, shadows at home. The envelope was thin, smudged with mud and time. Inside, a folded piece of paper, the ink faded but still legible. Dear Mama, I hope this letter finds you safe in camp. France is cold, but I think of Hawaii's sun and your rice cakes every night. Tell Aiko I'll bring her a doll from Paris. Your son, Kenji, 442nd RCT. It was one of thousands of letters that crossed oceans and fences during World War II. Words written from the bloodied fields of Europe to the barbed-wired deserts of America. Each carried a quiet defiance, love for a country that did not yet love them back. They were the voices of the Nisei soldiers, the second-generation Japanese Americans of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, and of the families they left behind in the internment camps scattered across the American West. Together, their stories reveal one of the most haunting contradictions in U.S. history. Men dying for freedom abroad, while their families were imprisoned for their ancestry at home. The postmarked paradox. When the Go for Broke soldiers marched through the mud of Italy and the forests of France, they did so under a flag that waved high above internment camps back home. In Manzanar, Tule Lake, Hart Mountain, and 10 other camps, mothers lined up for mail deliveries as guards watched from towers. Letters from sons in uniform were treasures, read and reread until the paper tore.
but every word was a reminder of a cruel truth. Their children were fighting for a country that saw them as a threat. Mail call was both hope and heartbreak. One mother at Heart Mountain kept her son's letters hidden inside a rice tin, afraid that if guards saw the words, "Go for broke," they might accuse him of secret codes. Another family received a notice instead of a letter. KIA, killed in action. They couldn't even hold a funeral outside campgrounds. Between duty and doubt. Back in Europe, soldiers like Private George Cicado and Sergeant Daniel Inouye wrote letters that balanced battlefield grit with quiet longing. Their words painted a picture of war and distance, of courage fueled not by anger, but by the desperate need to prove belonging. We fight two enemies. One wears gray, the other wears fear. The soldiers' mail was censored, their words carefully redacted before reaching home. Yet even stripped of detail, their letters burned with pride. They mentioned the liberation of villages, the cold nights in foxholes, and the dream of returning to a free America. But freedom was a complicated word. For the soldiers, it meant the right to fight and die under the stars and stripes. For their families, it meant surviving humiliation, confiscation, and confinement. Life behind the fences. While the letters traveled east to west, life in the camps unfolded in quiet endurance. The internment camps were built in remote deserts and swamps, barbed wire perimeters, guard towers, rows of wooden barracks with tar paper walls. At Manzanar, the wind blew dust through every crack. Families hung army blankets for privacy. Children recited the Pledge of Allegiance each morning, facing a flag that fluttered above the same fence, keeping them in. In the evenings, the internees gathered to listen to war news on crackling radios. When the announcer read out the victories of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, cheers mixed with tears. Some shouted the motto, "Go for broke," while others whispered prayers for the boys who might never return. The camps became paradoxical towns. They had schools, baseball teams, newspapers, even art classes. Yet freedom was an illusion. Every nail hammered into barrack walls echoed the injustice that had driven them there. Still, they wrote back, "Dear Kenji, we are so proud of you. The camp had a ceremony for the 442nd yesterday. Everyone cheered. The little ones are learning about France in school now. They say their big brothers are heroes. Stay safe, my son. Come home soon. Love, Mama." The cost of loyalty. As the 442nd fought in Italy and France, their reputation grew. The newspapers that once printed headlines like "Enemy Within" now praised the Nisei soldiers as heroes. But in the camps, life remained unchanged. Even the act of writing a letter was an act of faith. Mail was inspected, delayed, and sometimes confiscated. Families learned to write in code, subtle, emotional language that only loved ones could decode. "Have you eaten enough rice?" meant, "Are you still alive?" "The weather is cold here" meant, "We miss you more every day." Some soldiers sent money orders home, pay earned in battle sent to mothers who couldn't even buy a loaf of bread without permission slips. Others sent medals, folded flags, or photographs of their units, proof that their loyalty had been tested in blood. But the greatest proof came in silence. When soldiers learned that their parents had been labeled disloyal for protesting cap conditions, they said nothing. They fought harder. For them, the battlefield was the only courtroom that mattered.
Shadows of loss. Not all letters made it home. Some were found years later, unopened, in government archives. Others were buried with their writers beneath white crosses in European soil. One letter, discovered decades later in the archives of the National Japanese American Historical Society, read, "If I die here, tell Papa not to worry. Tell him I died as an American, same as anyone else. Tell him our family will walk free someday. The soldier never returned. His parents lived out their days in camp, released only after the war ended. Freedom did come, but quietly, without apology. Families were given $25 and a train ticket to nowhere. Their farms were gone, their homes looted, and the nation they had once called home now looked at them with pity instead of fear. Yet even in that silence, the letters remained, reminders of a dignity that no fence could erase.
Redemption in ink. Years after the war, historians unearthed thousands of these wartime letters. They revealed not just the story of soldiers in camps, but the heartbeat of a people determined to define what being American truly meant. From the foxholes of Italy to the deserts of Wyoming, their correspondence told a single truth. Loyalty is not proven by bloodline, but by choice. The letters became the missing pages of American history, chronicling both the shame and the redemption of a nation. They inspired books, films, and exhibits that forced future generations to ask, how can freedom exist when fear decides who belongs? Today, these letters are preserved in museums, fragile, yellowed with age, yet still echoing with the voices of those who wrote them. School children read them aloud during heritage events, not as relics, but as lessons. The legacy of silence. When the surviving veterans of the 442nd reunited decades later, many brought their mothers' letters, folded, faded, but never forgotten. Some still smell faintly of ink and campfire smoke. Others were written on army stationery, signed simply with love and hope. Senator Daniel Inouye, one of the unit's most decorated veterans, once said in a speech, "Every letter home was a declaration of loyalty, and every reply was an act of courage." It was true. Their families had survived shame with grace. The soldiers had turned prejudice into valor. Together, they had forced America to confront its reflection and, in time, to change it. Epilogue: The Unbroken Words. At the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, one display holds a single letter behind glass. The ink has nearly vanished, but the words remain clear. Dear Mama, the war will end soon. When it does, I'll take you beyond those fences. Your son, Kenji. He never made it home, but his promise did. Because of him and thousands like him, the fences came down, the silence broke, and the word American grew larger than anyone had imagined.
The Rising Sun and the American Dream. The photograph was small, black and white, edges frayed by time. In it, a young man stood proudly in a crisp U.S. Army uniform, the stars and stripes fluttering behind him. Beside it, on the same shelf, sat a faded Rising Sun banner folded neatly into a box. Two symbols, two worlds, and one story that had to be reconciled. It was the story of the Nisei soldiers, second-generation Japanese Americans who fought for a country that once imprisoned their families. They were sons of immigrants who had crossed the Pacific chasing dreams of freedom, only to be told they did not belong. Yet through fire and loss, they transformed their pain into purpose, forcing the United States to redefine what it meant to be American. This is the story of redemption, the long journey from discrimination to dignity, from barbed wire to honor rolls, from silence to legacy. The broken promise of liberty. When World War II ended in 1945, the world rejoiced. But for thousands of Japanese Americans returning from the front lines, peace did not mean freedom. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the most decorated unit of its size in U.S. military history, came home to a nation that still doubted them. Their medals shone brightly, but prejudice remained a shadow. In cities like Los Angeles and Seattle, returning Nisei soldiers found their homes vandalized and their families displaced. The internment camps were closing, but America was slow to open its heart. One veteran, Private George Sakato, recalled stepping off a train in uniform only to be refused service at a diner. "You fight for a country, and then it looks at you like you don't belong," he said later. For many, that moment defined the Second War, the war to reclaim their identity. Seeds of a new America. But change, like freedom, often begins quietly. In 1946, when Congress debated the McCarran-Walter Act, which would later reform immigration and citizenship laws, the Nisei veterans began to echo in the halls of power. Their battlefield bravery had caught the nation's attention, and their quiet dignity began to shift hearts. Letters from commanding officers poured into newspapers and government offices. One general wrote, "These men fought with unmatched courage. They bled more for America than many who never had to prove their loyalty." Public opinion, once poisoned by fear, began to heal. By the 1950s, Japanese American communities were slowly rebuilding. Farmers reclaimed land, students returned to universities, and families rebuilt the businesses that had been taken from them. And amid that struggle, the Nisei veterans became the bridge between memory and progress, between the rising sun of their ancestors and the shining stars of their new home. The road to recognition. The journey toward acceptance was not short, but every march begins with a step, and for Japanese Americans, that step was service and sacrifice. In 1959, Hawaii, home to many of the 442nd veterans, became the 50th U.S. state. Among those celebrating was Daniel K. Inouye, a war hero who had lost his arm in Italy and returned home to a life of public service. His rise from soldier to U.S. Senator was more than personal triumph, it was symbolic. When Inouye spoke in Congress for the first time, silence filled the chamber. The same government that had once labeled his people enemy aliens now listened to one of their own shaping national policy. Democracy is not perfect, but it allows men to correct their mistakes. We are living proof of that. The Nisei story became a moral compass, a reminder that patriotism is not blind obedience, but unwavering faith in a nation's potential to do better. From shame to Smithsonian. As the decades passed, the memories of internment began to fade from public view, but the survivors and their children refused to let history be rewritten. In the 1970s and 1980s, a new movement rose, the Japanese American Redress Campaign. It was led by Nisei veterans and their descendants, who demanded that the U.S. government acknowledge and apologize for the wartime incarceration. Old letters, photos, and diaries resurfaced as evidence of endurance and injustice. And once again, the same men who had fought for America became its conscience. In 1988, after decades of lobbying, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, officially apologizing for the internment and granting reparations to surviving internees. He said, "Here we admit a wrong. Here we reaffirm our commitment to equal justice under the law." For the Nisei, it wasn't about money. It was about truth, about being seen, finally, as what they had always been, Americans.
The rising sun meets the stars and stripes. The post-war years also brought cultural reconciliation. Japanese American soldiers who had once been shunned now represented a living connection between two nations that had fought bitterly. Their dual heritage became a bridge of peace. Many veterans traveled to Japan as diplomats, educators, and business leaders, helping to rebuild the very country their parents had left behind. In Tokyo, American and Japanese students studied side by side, exchanging not suspicion, but stories. The children of Nisei soldiers often described themselves as citizens of both worlds, carrying the discipline of the samurai and the dream of the American frontier. The phrase rising sun and stars and stripes began to symbolize something new, not division, but unity, proof that identity could be shared rather than split. Legacy of the Go for Broke spirit. Even decades after the war, the spirit of go for broke, give everything, hold nothing back, continued to inspire. In 2000, more than half a century after their heroism, the Nisei veterans of the 100th Infantry Battalion and 442nd Regimental Combat Team were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. President Bill Clinton addressed them in words that carried the weight of history. Rarely has a nation been so well served by a people it has so ill treated. The applause that followed was not just for courage in combat, but for endurance in injustice, for turning pain into progress, for proving that loyalty, once tested, can transform a nation's soul. Their story became required reading in schools and appeared in documentaries, novels, and museum exhibits. Young Americans, regardless of background, found inspiration in the Nisei's resilience. The lesson was universal. The American dream isn't inherited, it's earned. Redemption through memory. Today, at the Go for Broke Monument in Los Angeles' Little Tokyo, the names of over 16,000 Nisei soldiers are etched in stone. Visitors place origami cranes beside the inscriptions, small symbols of peace folded from the paper of remembrance. School groups stop and read the stories engraved there of men like Sadao Munemori, who threw himself on a grenade to save his comrades, of Kazuo Masuda, whose family's loyalty inspired General Eisenhower's public defense of Japanese Americans, of Daniel Inoue, who traded a rifle for a pen and changed the laws of a nation. Standing there, one can feel the weight of their message, that freedom is not granted by birth, but defined by sacrifice. The sun rises, the flag waves, and the story continues. The dream that belongs to all. The legacy of the Nisei soldiers reshaped the American identity. Their courage forced the country to confront its hypocrisy, to ask how a democracy could imprison its own citizens while preaching liberty abroad. In that confrontation came growth. The civil rights movement of the 1960s drew inspiration from the Nisei struggle. The redress victory in 1988 became a blueprint for justice for other communities wronged by government prejudice. Through their quiet defiance, the Nisei soldiers proved that America's strength lies not in perfection, but in the willingness to learn from its failures. They showed that patriotism is not blind faith, but active belief, belief that a nation can live up to its promise. Their story turned the page on a dark chapter and began another, one where the rising sun of heritage and the shining stars of democracy could coexist in one sky. Epilogue: What they stood for. At a small memorial service in 2021, a granddaughter of a Nisei veteran placed her hand on his engraved name and whispered, "Grandpa, you fought for both, Japan's honor and America's dream." And in that moment, the generations that followed understood. The rising sun no longer stood opposite the stars and stripes. Together, they illuminated what the Nisei soldiers had always believed, that to be American is not about where you come from, but what you stand for.